Okay, so this one is going to be more on monster homebrewing. So scrolling through Instagram, as I do on occasion, a lot of it is, for your information, a lot of my Instagram feed is knives, art, and D&D stuff. So come across a homebrew channel that just does homebrew stuff. Specifically, the post I encounter is a stat block for the Necromorph from Dead Space. If you're not familiar, that's a space zombie game. Very good one. At least the first one is. First and second are both good. So one of the main things about that game is it had this limb cutting system where enemies were super tanky and difficult to take out unless you cut off their limbs, which would make them less immediately dangerous, as in, one of them, like, they have two big arms with blades on the end. You cut off one of them, okay, it only has one arm to attack you with, so it's less dangerous that way. And it's also, you can cut off their legs to get them on the ground, and it's just also, like, if you were to cut off all their limbs, they just kind of instantly die. And to my understanding of the lore, the reason this was is because everything was just actual animated dead tissue. There was no biological processes going on, nothing, like no blood flow, nothing like that. So a lot of like superficial tissue damage resulting in blood loss that would like kill a human, they don't care about at all. So what you have to do is destroy their structure. Ligaments, bones, joints, all that stuff. You have to destroy those things in order to put these monsters down. And that's what the limb cutting system is. So I came across this stat block, and it does mostly a decent job of portraying this kind of these qualities that these monsters have. They're like CR1, so they're not particularly strong. They've got like 26 hit points, and then they've got a bunch of like damage. They've got a bunch of damage resistances and immunities, which they're undead. But they specifically have vulnerability to slashing damage. Now, the other thing that they have is a lot of what I will call poorly worded features that basically they amount to kind of standard undead stuff, which doesn't need to be written. Like, you don't really need to write down that undead don't need to eat, sleep, or breathe. That's just part of being undead. You don't really need to write that, to my understanding. But specifically, what this writes up is there's two important traits. One that states, it's kind of like flavor text, really. It's not really a trait. This doesn't need to be here, but it talks about how the Necromorph can't just be killed by taking it to 0 hit points. You need to cut off a limb. See this other feature. So it's really more flavor text than anything else. And then when you look at the other feature, it describes, if you take a Necromorph down to 0 HP, on its next turn or on the next round, I forget exactly what it said, it regains all its HP and stands back up. Okay, cool. That's pretty simple. You can't just kill it. And instead, you need to cut off a limb. And specifically, it also states that, which it doesn't need to say this either, but it is actually kind of important, that you need to cut off an important limb like an arm or a leg. And when it revives, superficial damage, like cuts, like deep cuts, and specifically the loss of a head, regrow. Which, the head was a limb that it would count towards in the game. So, that's sort of a buff to it in this transition. And then it also kind of has another issue. Specifically, it states that this creature whenever it says it's immune to critical hits, and then it goes on to explain what a critical hit does against it. Get rid of that immune to critical hits portion, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, when you deal a critical hit to this creature, you don't do extra damage. Instead, you cut off a limb. And whenever you land a critical hit, roll a d6 to determine the type of limb you cut off, like arm, leg, tail, head. And specifically, if you roll a 1, you cut off a head, which, if you read earlier, it says that this regenerates, so I guess it doesn't count as a limb to cut off, which is weird. So you have to roll above a 1 on this d6 to do anything meaningful to it, which is a separate thing, which adds a layer of failure, even if you get a critical hit, which is a problem. And the other thing about this is there's no other way to interact with this limb system other than a critical hit. So if you're fighting one of these things, basically all you can do, the whole party has to stand around it and keep hitting it until like one of you gets a critical hit and it dies. That's basically it. That's how this combat will go, written this way. And presumably, you're not going to just use one of these things, you're going to use a few. So really what you're doing is you stand there and you attack it until it goes down. And then if it's down and prone at 0 HP, then everybody can walk up to it and attack it while it's prone and unconscious for free crits. That guy just ran a red light. You can attack it when it's prone for free crits, which is fine, assuming, like, you know, you can take it down and you still have player turns left before its next turn and it gets back up. But that's kind of it. That's the only real way to interact with this. You just attack it and hope you get a crit, or you take it down to 0 HP and everybody just walks up to it and attacks it. And if you hope to get a crit, or, well, you would get a free crit because it's unconscious, and then it dies. Sort of boring, especially if you're fighting one. It could be tense because they keep getting back up if you're fighting a group. But the problem is, like, you know, per normal rules without any kind of homebrew, there's no real way to interact with this system. Which I can think of a few homebrew systems. Or actually, there is one. And that is the overkill system, where when you deal damage that takes it to 0 hit points, if the extra damage left over than what was needed to take it to 0 hit points, if that extra damage is equal to or greater than the creature's max HP, it dies instantly. That could work. So it's got 26 hit points, not a whole lot, not a huge amount, but enough, especially at lower levels, when players are doing like 13 damage per attack, like kind of at bows with like a longsword. There's other things, not going to go into that. So, you know, if you deal this extra damage, but you have to find some way to, like, get it to 1 hit point and then do 27 damage in a single hit, which at lower levels you could do, but it might be a lot of resources for just a fodder monster. So that's kind of an issue. But that is something that exists. The instant death rules do allow this monster to be killed without any homebrew directly. The other two systems are relatively common systems I see, and one that I use. The first one that I don't really use is the called shot system that a lot of people will use. Like, you know, you make a called shot, like, okay, I'm hitting its arm. Okay, take a -5 to your attack roll. And then if you still hit, then you hit the arm. Okay, great. Then that is pretty simple, direct, and it plays into that. But if you don't want to use that kind of system, then instead you do the opposite. Anytime you roll 5 or more over the monster's AC, you cut off a limb. That's something like that kind of over AC mechanic is something that you don't see in official books, but you see relatively frequently in homebrew. And I think, if I remember correctly, I've seen it in previous homebrew from this Instagram channel. I forget the name. It's like D&D Homebrewing 04 or something. I forget the name. But that is another way to interact with it, because, you know, if you roll really, really high, that's a really good shot, and you cleave off a limb, and that can weaken this monster enough, because otherwise this monster is not a CR1. This is like a CR4, because it's just going to keep getting back up, especially if this, and more than one makes this exponentially more dangerous because they don't die. But so that's kind of the issue with this monster. It's not interactive enough. And that is a big point I try to hone in on whenever I'm designing any kind of monster. I want them to be interactive in some way instead of just a pile of hit points and attacks that, like, you know, that the players hit and then the monster throws attacks back until one of them is dead. Like, no, I'm not trying to run monsters that are like that. I want some dynamic features that you can interact with. Whether it's like special conditional opportunity attacks that happen when the monster does something dramatic, you know, a reaction that can dominate a player for just that attack that they make against this monster, which I thought was something that my boss monster in the most recent Site 27 used. But the point is, like, I feel like a lot of homebrew kind of just, it ends up just being like sacks of hit points, NAC, and monsters, and there isn't this element of interactivity. And players will naturally try to do these types of things. They'll try to interact with they'll try to interact with mechanics, and they'll try to come up with stuff. Like, simply stuff like, you know, a basilisk. It has that stone gaze. Players will say, oh, my character shuts his eyes. Okay, well, you're blinded versus this creature now. And you have to arbitrate that when players come up with this stuff, which I think is some of the more interesting moments in any kind of TTRPG. A player tries something, the DM arbitrates it, and you figure out how it's going to work. But the point I'm getting at, using this, what I will call overall poorly designed monster, the point I'm getting at is you gotta try to include interactivity in a monster, otherwise it's kind of boring. It's like that idea, it's kind of why the adventuring day mechanic is not used very often in most tables. Like, you're supposed to have like 6 to 8 combats an adventuring day, and some of those combats are supposed to be like trivial. Like, you know, you're level 9 and you fight 5 goblins. What the hell? Why am I like, nobody? That's not interesting for anybody. If for certain tables, sure. If you are much more into the combat and into the nuance, then sure, yeah. But my tables, the tables I play at, that's probably not going to be very interesting. It's going to feel like a waste of time. And there are merits to that, like, say, you know, the DM trying to kill time, come up with something, or try to fill time in this session because they don't have anything planned, and they need, you know, a planning day on Tuesday to write some stuff down and figure out what the next, like, what is even in the next town, for example. Things like that. That can be fun. Just throw out a combat, but at the end of the day, like, the adventuring day doesn't get used because trivial combats are boring. Like, if monsters are too easy and there's nothing to interact with, it's not that exciting. If there's no danger, it's not exciting, and if there's nothing to figure out, it's not exciting. You need at least one of those. Like, maybe these monsters are, like, really weak, but they have something that basically makes them invulnerable, and you have to figure out how to deal with it. And sometimes, like in the case of these necromorphs, maybe the players can come up with some way to beat them that you didn't account for. And that's fine. But I feel like you should try to include some kind of interactivity into most monsters you design. Not everything needs it, but try to keep that in mind for any monster homebrewing you do. Interactivity is good. Yeah, that's it for this little rant.